They say the wind in Bledsoe County never stops, not back then, anyway. It screamed like a banshee across the plains, mourning the death of something ancient and human. Dust coated everything, settling into the corners of every cabin, into teeth, into lungs, into memory. But what the wind couldn't bury, what it couldn't cover, was what the Whitfield family did to themselves. Like all American tragedies, it began with the promise of land. 35 acres of brittle soil were given to a man who trusted neither God, nor doctors, nor outsiders. His name was Ellis Whitfield, and what he planted in that dirt wasn't corn or wheat, but a bloodline that would consume itself. Of course, the townspeople whispered. They spoke in places like Harlan's General Store over chipped enamel mugs under the glow of gaslight. They said the Whitfields never left their property. They said the family had their own words for things, their own rules, their own children. And after the third dust storm of '34, when livestock turned up bloated and local children fell ill, they feared something other than the wind. They feared that old, rotting homestead on Millage Road. You won't find the Whitfields in school records, census data, or church logs. The only paper that ever bore their name was a missing persons report filed by a school teacher named Miss Lya Grange. She claimed she saw a boy watching her from the tree line, a boy who looked as if he'd been stitched together wrong. One of his eyes was sealed shut, and his fingers were fused in a way no fever could cause. She said he mouthed something that was not English, not even human. When she told the sheriff, he just shook his head and said, "That's the Whitfields. Leave them alone." But you don't just leave this kind of history alone, because what happened on that land wasn't simply inbreeding, poverty, or madness. It was something colder, something deliberate, as if the family believed they were destined to become something more, something beyond blood and bone. And in their isolation, they did. They left no journals or recordings, but they did leave behind a house, half collapsed and rotten with mildew and silence. Inside, beneath the floorboards, someone discovered hundreds of drawings. Not one of them showed a face with two eyes in the right place. The earliest trace of the Whitfield name in Bledsoe County dates back to 1891, when a man named Thaddeus Whitfield arrived with a mule, a deaf wife, and a newborn. No one knew where he came from. He paid for the land with cash, dirty, blood-flecked banknotes that smelled of sweat and iron. He built the house himself, piece by piece, with no help and no witnesses. Once the roof was on, the Whitfields were never seen again, not in town, not at the market, not even at funerals. Rumors took root quickly. Some people said Thaddeus was a war deserter hiding from justice. Others claimed he came from a backwoods family so twisted that even Arkansas wouldn't claim them. But the truth is simpler and darker. Thaddeus believed in purity, not the kind preached from a pulpit, but a purity of control. He believed blood was the only law that mattered and that outside ideas, like schooling, government, and medicine, were poisons meant to dilute the soul. So, he kept his wife locked inside that house. And when she bore him a daughter, he didn't see her as a child, he saw her as a continuation of his lineage, the future. The pattern had begun. By the time his first daughter turned 13, she was pregnant. The midwife, dragged to the house under threat, never spoke again, but she left behind a torn page from her journal. The child was born with no eyelids. It didn't cry. It watched. From there, things accelerated. Each child had children. Generations folded in on themselves like a quilt made of rot. Faces changed. Voices grew stranger. One cousin, if you could still call them that, was born with no fingernails and hair that grew in circular patches along her back. They named her Nell, and she became their matriarch, still a child. The townspeople kept their distance. Their fear was not loud, it was quiet, embedded in glances and sudden silences. Everyone knew where the Whitfields lived and everyone knew not to go there after dark, or at all. But isolation only strengthened the family's beliefs. They considered themselves chosen, not cursed. They believed the deformities were signs that their bodies were being reshaped for a higher purpose, one that no outsider could understand. A purpose that came not from heaven but from something older, something that lived deep beneath the fields in the black soil, listening. It was no longer just survival, it was ritual. By 1932, the Dust Bowl was already choking the Midwest into silence. Crops failed. Livestock lay down and died without protest. But on Millage Road, the Whitfields thrived, if you could call it that. They didn't plant crops like others. They didn't trade or till. Their sustenance came from something unseen, and no one in town dared to ask what it was. Children began to vanish from neighboring counties, not many, just one here, one there. A boy pulling water from a well. A girl picking apples from her father's tree. Gone. No screams, no blood, just absence. Most blamed the storms or the sickness that crept through the dry wind. But a few old men whispered something else. They said the Whitfield children had grown hungry. The youngest generation, those born in the final years before the collapse, were barely human anymore. They had misshapen heads, bent spines, and skin so pale it seemed translucent. But worse than how they looked was how they moved, too fast, too fluid, as if their bones weren't where they should be. They communicated in gestures, sharing a gaze that could empty a man's stomach. Travelers who passed too close spoke of shadows watching them from beneath dry trees. One man claimed he woke to find handprints on his windshield, 6 fingers long and webbed. Another swore he saw a girl crouched on the edge of the road at night, her jaw distended as if it had come unhinged, mouthing words he couldn't hear. When the town sheriff finally mustered the nerve to investigate, he took 2 deputies. Only one returned. He didn't speak for 3 days, and when he did, he said only one thing before putting a bullet through his temple: they see without eyes. No one went near the land after that. The Whitfields became ghosts, still alive but untouchable, a bad dream made flesh. And the land around their home began to change. Trees leaned toward the house as if listening. Grass wouldn't grow within 20 feet of the porch, and animals, wild or domestic, refused to cross onto the property. One night, a neighbor reported hearing music drifting from the homestead, not a fiddle, not a piano, but something hollow, slow, carved from breath and bone, a lullaby for something inhuman. That same night, every mirror in the neighbor's house cracked down the center. The Whitfield home was built from pine, but by the 1930s, it looked more like bone, sun-bleached, bowed inward, as if the house itself was ashamed of what it held. Windows had long since been boarded up, not with nails but with sinew and wire, materials the local blacksmith swore he never sold. No one had been inside for years, but stories leaked out, whispered by drifters who passed too close and by children who dared each other to touch the fence. They said the house breathed. In the dead heat of summer, when no wind stirred and the sky turned the color of ash, neighbors could hear a faint wheezing from the Whitfield land. It was slow and rhythmic, like a lung struggling to fill with dust. With every exhale came the stench of mold, rot, and something worse, something that didn't belong in the air of this world. Inside the house, names were forbidden. The Whitfields didn't call each other by anything you'd recognize. They communicated with clicks, grunts, and long hums that echoed up through the floorboards. Children were not taught to speak, they were taught to listen to what no one could say. There were no photographs, no written records, not even marks on the walls, just dozens of crude etchings on dried animal hide, nailed to the rafters. They depicted twisted figures and circles of bodies kneeling before something always of the same shape, something tall, faceless, crowned with antlers and teeth. Locals once found one of those hides washed up in a creek bed 3 miles south. Its edges were burned, and the blood used for ink had turned black. A traveling priest took one look at it and walked into the woods without a word. His boots were found weeks later, still tied neatly, pointing toward the Whitfield land. People started forgetting things, not just memories, but entire names. Streets changed, old families left, and no one could remember why. It was as if the Whitfields weren't just infecting their own bloodline but unraveling the land around them, strand by strand. And through it all, the house remained silent, watching, becoming more alive and more wrong with each generation. Visitors said they heard laughter inside, thin, broken laughter, like children playing in a language meant for something without a soul. They never saw who made the sound. By the final years of the Dust Bowl, when even the wind seemed exhausted, something shifted on the Whitfield land. People in town said the family had finally gone silent. No more sightings, no more shadows in the road. The house sat still under layers of dust so thick it blurred its outline, as if the land itself wanted to forget it. But silence doesn't mean peace, and it certainly didn't mean death. A state surveyor named Franklin Boone was sent in 1937 to map the area for soil restoration. He had heard the warnings but was a rational man, a military background, Baptist upbringing. He believed in maps, not monsters, and he believed the Whitfields were just a sick family buried in superstition. He lasted 2 days. When he was found, he was barefoot and shaking, crouched beneath a bridge 10 miles from the property line. His hands were covered in dirt and blood. His tongue had been bitten in half. The only thing he left behind was his notebook, and what was written inside wasn't in English. It wasn't in any known script. It looked grown, organic, like veins pressed into the page. After Boone, no one else was sent. And yet, somehow the house remained intact, more intact than it should have been. When a drought-fueled fire swept through the valley in '39, it devoured everything in its path except the Whitfield home. Firefighters swore the blaze simply parted around it, as if pushed back, as if whatever lived inside had made a pact with the elements. There were no more births, no more cries, no more tracks, but the house pulsed. Witnesses said the board seemed to move, swelling outward like lungs beneath skin. And late at night, those foolish enough to linger claimed they saw hunched shapes on the roof, watching. Not people. Not anymore. By the 1940s, maps began omitting Millage Road entirely. Locals stopped calling the land cursed. They stopped calling it anything. Children weren't told not to go there, they weren't told it existed. And soon, even the memory of the Whitfields began to rot. But if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Would you run? Would you stay? Or would you become what they became, without question, without fear, without a name? In 1952, nearly 2 decades after the last Whitfield was supposedly seen, a traveling photographer named Cal Meyer wandered through Bledsoe County. He was chasing forgotten Americana, barns split by time, broken fence posts, empty churches with windblown pews. Instead, he found the Whitfield property. He didn't mean to, he was lost, following a birdless sky and a dried-up creek. But as the dust parted, the house emerged like a memory forced back into the mind, still standing, still intact. The boards didn't creak. The windows were still sealed shut. Not a single spiderweb, not a single insect. No signs of life, no signs of death. And yet, the front door was open. Cal claimed he didn't enter. He said something stopped him cold, a smell, a pressure in the air like the entire field was holding its breath. But before he could turn, he saw a figure. A boy no older than 10 stood just inside the threshold, pale, too pale and silent. What haunts most about Cal's account isn't what the boy did, it's what he didn't do. He didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't move. His arms hung at his sides as if he didn't know what they were for. His head tilted slowly, too slowly, like a machine mimicking a gesture it didn't understand. And his eyes were hollow. Not empty, not blind, hollow, in Cal's words. It felt like he was looking through me, like he'd seen what I was before I became it. He took one photograph, just one, and then he ran. The photo was never published, never printed. But years later, when his belongings were sold after his death, the film was developed. The boy is there, blurry, bent, too tall for his age, his spine curling the wrong way. Behind him, shapes hang from the ceiling, not bodies, not quite, but limbs bundled and arranged like wind chimes. Experts say the photo was tampered with, that the blur is too consistent, that the shadows are too intelligent. But others, those who grew up near Bledsoe, know better. They know what was seen and, worse, what wasn't. Because when locals examined the photo, they noticed something behind the boy, in the far corner of the frame, a woman with a wide mouth and cracked skin, her eyes stitched shut. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at the boy, and she was smiling. Some stories fade because time erases them. The story of the Whitfields fades because something deeper wants it buried. To this day, No formal record of the family exists beyond fragments, a deed, a sheriff's log, a torn journal entry. Every attempt to document their history ends the same way: missing pages, corrupted files, researchers walking away mid-sentence, unable to explain why their hands won't stop shaking. One archivist from the State Historical Office went blind for 3 days after handling the Boone notebook. No diagnosis, no trauma, just darkness. He woke up whispering, "They're not gone, they're beneath." Bledsoe County has changed. There are new roads, new farms, and new names, but locals know where not to build. There's a stretch of land still marked off by rusted fencing and dead trees. Developers say it's unstable, bad soil, bad luck. No one touches it. No one questions it because every so often, once every few years, someone hears it. Breathing. Not wind, not earth shifting. Breathing, deep, low, steady, like lungs that have never stopped expanding. And when the sound comes, animals go silent. Dogs bark toward empty corners. Children wake screaming with mouths full of dirt. They say the Whitfield line ended, that the deformities, the rituals, the isolation, all of it collapsed under its own monstrous weight. But some say that's not what happened. Some say the family succeeded. They became exactly what they were meant to become. That through blood, dust, and darkness, they crossed over into something else. Something less than human and more than flesh. Not ghosts, not demons, just evolution gone feral. A new branch of being coiled beneath the fields, waiting for the land to forget it enough to rise again. And maybe they're right. Maybe that boy Cal Meyer saw is still out there, still 10 years old, never aging. Maybe he wasn't born. Maybe he was made, formed from hunger and silence and the long, slow ache of a family trying to become gods in a world that never wanted them. So, if you ever find yourself driving through western Bledsoe and the road curves in a way your map doesn't show, don't follow it. If you hear laughter with no source, see shapes at the edge of your headlights, or smell something like rust, earth, and decay, turn around, because you haven't found a forgotten history. It has found you. And the Whitfields don't let go. Not when you've heard their name. Not when you've seen their house. Not when you've started to remember. They only need one thing to come back, someone who believes. And now you do.